The static crackled first, a sound like grinding teeth. Then the voice, strained and thin, clawed its way through the ether from the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains. Havoc TOC, this is Trident Lead. We are Winchester on 338, danger close. Estimate enemy platoon strength, dug in. We are compromised and taking effective fire from 3 positions. How copy? The Tactical Operations Center was a cavern of cold air and colder screens. On the main display, a Predator drone feed showed 4 flickering heat signatures huddled behind a sliver of rock on a wind-scoured ridgeline designated Objective Serpent's Tooth. Around them, dozens of brighter signatures swarmed like angry wasps. Red triangles marked the established positions of DSHK heavy machine guns, their streams of tracer fire painting faint, deadly lines in the infrared spectrum. Colonel Madsen stood before the screen, arms crossed, his face a granite mask of calculated loss. He keyed his microphone, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, the final word of a procedural death sentence. Trident Lead, be advised, air extraction is a no-go. QRF is 60 mics out, best case. The weather front is closing in, and we can't risk a bird in that kill box. Air-to-ground support is denied due to proximity of friendlies. I repeat, air exfil is a no-go. The reply was cut short by a burst of static and the distant, sickeningly clear thump-thump-thump of a heavy machine gun finding its range. The 4 heat signatures pressed themselves flatter against the unforgiving rock. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. In the back of the TOC, leaning against a server rack and half-shrouded in shadow, a figure stood motionless. Chief Warrant Officer 4 Anya Rostova listened, her eyes fixed on the screen, her expression unreadable. She had heard variations of that transmission 100 times. A situation deemed impossible by men who saw the world as a series of acceptable risk percentages. Men who didn't understand that, for the people on the ground, the only acceptable percentage was 100. Madsen finally turned from the screen, his jaw tight. He saw her, a ghost in a flight suit, and his gaze hardened. He knew what she was thinking. He'd seen that look before, a quiet intensity that always preceded a suggestion that bent regulations until they screamed. Don't even start, Rostova, he said, his voice low but carrying across the hushed room. I'm not sending a $17 million asset and its crew into that meat grinder. The simulation gives a 92% chance of catastrophic loss. It's a mathematical certainty. Anya didn't argue. She didn't debate the numbers or plead the case. She simply met his gaze and held it for a beat longer than was comfortable. In her eyes, there was no defiance, only a quiet, unnerving certainty of her own. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not agreement. Then, she turned and walked out of the TOC, her footsteps making no sound against the concrete floor. The door hissed shut behind her, leaving Madsen alone with his math and the dying embers on his screen. He had declared it impossible. For Anya Rostova, that was just the starting parameter. The dismissal from Colonel Madsen hung in the air of the TOC, a final, leaden verdict. He turned back to the screen, his posture rigid, already mentally composing the after-action report, the letters of condolence. He was a man who trusted data, who built his career on mitigating risk and adhering to doctrine. The variables on Serpent's Tooth were a cascade of red flags. Entrenched heavy weapons, an approaching storm front that would ground any conventional air support, and a complex, narrow valley approach that was a textbook ambush site. Sending in a helicopter was not a gamble. It was suicide sanctioned by him. A young lieutenant monitoring communications looked up. Sir, Trident Lead reports they're attempting to break contact, falling back to the western face. Madsen shook his head without looking away from the screen. They won't make it 10 meters. The Dushka on the northern spur has them pinned. They're just changing the location of their last stand. His tone was grimly pragmatic. He was now managing the inevitable, not preventing it. Meanwhile, Anya Rostova moved with a fluid economy of motion through the hangar bay. The air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid, jet fuel, and ozone. The massive form of her MH-60M Black Hawk, call sign Nightshade 1, sat in the amber glow of the maintenance lights. It was a machine honed to a razor's edge, its matte black skin absorbing the light, its surfaces bristling with silent, deadly purpose. It wasn't a standard bird. Its rotor system was modified for acoustic dampening, its engine exhausts fitted with advanced infrared suppressors, its belly housing a sensor suite that could map the emotional state of a field mouse from 1,000 feet. Her co-pilot, Warrant Officer 1 Evans, was already in the right-hand seat, running through the pre-flight checklist with a nervous energy that made the pages of his kneeboard rustle. He was fresh from Fort Rucker, brilliant in the simulator, but his flight hours were mostly logged over the placid Alabama countryside. This was his first deployment, his first taste of the real thing. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a little tight. "Tosi hasn't greenlit any launch." Colonel Madsen was explicit. Anya swung herself into the left-hand seat, the armored plates of her vest settling into the familiar contours of the cockpit chair. She didn't answer him immediately. Her movements were a ritual, a silent conversation with the machine. Her fingers danced across the instrument panel, flipping switches, testing systems. The cockpit came alive around her, the multifunction displays blooming with green and amber light. Her gloved hand came to rest for a moment on the collective pitch control. Just below the grip, a long, jagged scar ran across the metal, a silvery line against the dark gray paint. A souvenir from a previous impossible mission in the Hindu Kush, where an RPG fragment had punched through the floor. The scar was a reminder that metal could break, that survival was a matter of inches and instincts. She finally keyed her helmet mic, her voice calm and even, cutting through Evans' anxiety. "Run the APU start sequence, Evans." "But, ma'am," the colonel. Anya turned her head, and for the first time, Evans saw the full force of her focus. Her eyes, magnified slightly by the visor of her helmet, seemed to see right through him, to the core of his fear. "The colonel is in a room full of screens, looking at numbers," she said, her voice a low murmur in his headset. "I'm looking at the aircraft. The numbers say we'll fail. The aircraft says we'll fly. Start the sequence." It wasn't an order given with anger or frustration. It was a statement of fact, as simple and undeniable as gravity. Evans swallowed hard, his own fear eclipsed by the sheer, unshakable confidence radiating from the woman beside him. He nodded, his hands suddenly steady as he flipped the switch for the auxiliary power unit. The high-pitched whine began to fill the cockpit. Anya reached up and touched a small, faded patch on the shoulder of her flight suit. It was a simple embroidered silhouette of a winged woman carrying a spear, a Valkyrie. It had been given to her years ago by a green beret she'd pulled out of a burning village, a man who had declared his team dead until her bird descended through the smoke like a phantom. She didn't wear it for vanity. She wore it as a reminder of her purpose, to go where others would not, to retrieve those who were deemed lost. The turbines began to spool, the whine deepening into a hungry roar. The rotors began their slow, heavy turn. On the ground, the crew chief gave a thumbs up, his face a mixture of confusion and awe. He hadn't received a launch order, but he knew better than to question CW04 Rostova when she was in the pilot's seat. Nightshade 1 was coming to life. The main rotor blades of Nightshade 1 sliced through the humid air, each rotation a percussive whump-whump that was more felt than heard. Anya's touch on the controls was impossibly light. She eased the collective up, and 17,000 pounds of steel, fuel, and purpose lifted off the tarmac with the grace of a dragonfly. There was no lurch, no shudder. One moment they were on the ground, the next they were airborne, rising into the bruised purple of the encroaching twilight. "TOC, be advised, Nightshade 1 is wheels up," Anya transmitted, her voice a placid sea in the storm of radio chatter. Colonel Madsen's voice came back instantly, sharp with fury. "Negative, Nightshade. You are not authorized. Return to base immediately." "That is a direct order, Rostova." Anya's fingers tightened infinitesimally on the cyclic. Unable to comply, Havoc TOC. Experiencing temporary comms malfunction on this channel, she switched frequencies to the encrypted net used by the SEALs. Trident lead, this is Valkyrie. I am inbound. Talk to me. A burst of gunfire answered her before a voice, ragged with exhaustion and disbelief, came through. Valkyrie? Affirm, call sign Valkyrie? We were told. Command said no one was coming. Command is a little busy right now, Anya said, her eyes scanning the forward-looking infrared display. The mountains ahead were a serrated spine of black and gray, a world of sharp edges and deep shadows. Give me a sit rep. I need the Dushka. Got a 127 millimeters on the north spur, another on the eastern ridge. RPG teams are maneuvering between them. They're boxing us in. The north gun is our biggest problem. It's got our position zeroed. Copy that, Trident. Evans sat rigid in his seat, his knuckles white where he gripped the controls. He was flying co-pilot, but he felt like a passenger on a runaway train. Ma'am, we're painting multiple ground threats. The threat board is lighting up like a Christmas tree. I see them, Anya confirmed, her tone betraying no more concern than if she were spotting traffic on a freeway. She pushed the Black Hawk lower, skimming the desert floor. The terrain rose to meet them, the flat expanse giving way to rocky wadis and deep arroyos. She flew not over the landscape, but through it, using the earth itself as a shield. The helicopter became a predator, a creature of the shadows, its dark form nearly invisible against the rock. The wind was picking up, the storm front pressing in from the west. Turbulent gusts tried to shove the aircraft off course, but Anya's hands and feet moved in a constant, fluid dance on the controls, anticipating and correcting for every buffet of air before it could register. The entrance to the Valley of the Serpent loomed ahead, a dark slash in the mountainside. Doctrine dictated a high-altitude approach to minimize exposure to small arms, but doctrine didn't account for dug-in heavy machine guns with clear fields of fire on every high-altitude corridor. Anya was throwing the book away. She was going in low, where the enemy wouldn't be looking, where their heavy guns couldn't depress far enough to target her. Fleur to max resolution, she ordered. The world outside the canopy dissolved into a high-contrast ghost image of heat and cold. The rocks were cool gray, but the muzzle of a recently fired weapon would glow white-hot. As they entered the canyon, the walls closed in. The roar of the rotors echoed back at them, a deafening cacophony. Proximity alarms began to chirp, a nervous, insistent sound. Evan's breathing grew shallow. Their rotor tips were mere feet from the sheer rock walls. Ma'am, canyon walls? We're too close, he stammered. The canyon is our cover, Anya said, her gaze locked forward, her mind processing the torrent of information from her senses and the aircraft systems. She wasn't just flying the helicopter. She was wearing it. The vibrations in the airframe told her about the wind currents. The subtle shifts in the engine's whine told her about the power demands. They raced through the twisting gorge, a black shadow moving at over 100 knots through a tunnel of rock. Up ahead, the valley widened slightly, and the Fleur picked it up, a bloom of intense heat on a ledge overlooking the canyon exit. The northern Dushka emplacement. It was positioned to fire down on the ridgeline where the SEALs were trapped, but it was blind to the threat screaming up the canyon from below. Door gunner right side. Target, ledge, 200 meters, 11 o'clock. Anya's voice was clipped, precise. I see it. Target acquired. The crew chief called from his station at the M134 minigun. Anya didn't slow down. She held her course, a predator closing on its prey. The SEALs needed that gun silenced, not just suppressed. They needed a decisive blow. A single, perfect strike that would change the geometry of the entire battlefield. The Dushka emplacement grew rapidly in the gunner's sight. Anya counted the seconds in her head, judging the angle, the speed, the exact moment of perfect alignment. The men manning the gun were oblivious, their attention focused on the trapped soldiers above them. They were looking for a threat from the sky, not a demon rising from the earth. Engage, Anya said, her voice a blade of ice. The minigun erupted. It wasn't the chattering of a conventional machine gun. It was a furious, high-pitched snarl, like a chainsaw tearing through sheet metal. A solid stream of tracers, invisible to the naked eye but brilliant on the IR display, spewed from the side of the Black Hawk. For a fraction of a second, the stream of fire connected the helicopter to the ledge, a spear of incandescent light. The 762mm rounds, firing at a rate of 4,000 per minute, shredded the gun emplacement. The heavy machine gun, the sandbags, the crew. It all vanished in a cloud of pulverized rock and superheated metal. The ammunition cache for the Dushka cooked off in a secondary explosion, a brilliant white flash that momentarily washed out the FLIR display. One moment, the gun was the single greatest threat to the SEALs. The next, it was a smoking crater. Anya banked the helicopter hard, the G-forces pressing Evans into his seat, and shot out of the canyon mouth, climbing rapidly toward the ridgeline. Back in the TOC, the red triangle marking the northern Dushka blinked once, then disappeared from the map. A stunned silence fell over the room. Colonel Madsen stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. He keyed his mic, his voice hesitant, stripped of its earlier fury. Nightshade status. Anya's voice came back, as calm as ever, the roar of the wind the only hint of the violence of her maneuver. Northern gun is neutralized. Moving to exfil position. Valkyrie is on station. On Serpent's Tooth, Trident Lead watched the fireball bloom on the spur below him. He'd been seconds away from ordering his men to use their last grenades on themselves. Now, a black shape was rising from the canyon like an avenging angel. He keyed his radio, his voice thick with a hope he hadn't felt an hour ago. Solid copy, Valkyrie. We see you. Pop smoke. LZ is hot. Hope was a dangerous commodity on Serpent's Tooth, but for the first time in hours, the 4 SEALs allowed themselves to feel it. The elimination of the northern Dushka was not just the removal of a threat. It was a statement. A brutal, efficient declaration that the rules of this engagement had just been rewritten. The enemy, however, was not a static force. They were seasoned fighters, quick to adapt. The sudden, violent demise of their most dominant weapon position sent a shockwave of alarm through their ranks. They had been toying with the trapped Americans, confident in their superiority. Now, they were faced with an unknown, an aircraft that moved with unnatural speed and precision, appearing from a direction they had deemed impossible. RPG teams, previously moving with casual confidence, now scrambled for new positions. They understood the new threat vector. The Black Hawk had used the canyon for cover. It would likely try to use the ridgeline itself for its next move. Men with RPG-7 launchers on their shoulders began climbing higher, seeking angles that would allow them to fire down on any potential landing zone. From her cockpit, Anya saw it all unfold on her displays. The FLIR highlighted the hot tubes of the rocket launchers as men scurried up the scree slopes. Evans mark RPGs. 3 teams, high ground, sectors Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Marked, ma'am, Evans replied, his voice steadier now. The initial shock had been replaced by a focused adrenaline. He was witnessing a masterclass in aerial combat, and his own training was kicking in. He was no longer a terrified passenger. He was part of the process. In the TOC, Colonel Madsen watched the same tactical picture. The remaining Dushka on the eastern ridge began to chatter, its tracers reaching blindly into the dark, searching for the phantom that had declawed them. Valkyrie, be advised. Madsen's voice was different now, not commanding, but collaborative. Multiple RPG threats repositioning to your east and north. They're anticipating your extraction point. Copy TOC, Anya replied. They're expecting a hover extraction on the peak. What's your assessment? Madsen asked. It was a pivotal moment. He was no longer dictating. He was asking for her expert opinion. He was ceding tactical control to the pilot he had tried to ground. A hover is a death trap, Anya stated simply. We're not going to hover. On the ground, Trident Lead watched the RPG teams moving. Valkyrie, they're bracketing any viable LZ. We can't hold out long enough for you to settle in. You won't have to, Trident. Get ready to move. On my signal. The trust was building, a fragile bridge being constructed in the middle of a firefight, connecting the desperate men on the ground, the stunned commander in the TOC, and the silent pilot in the sky. Anya nudged the cyclic, and Nightshade 1 danced away from a probing burst of fire from the eastern gun, the tracers passing harmlessly behind her tail boom. She descended again, dropping below the crest of the ridgeline, disappearing from the enemy's line of sight. To the fighters on the mountain, it might have looked like a retreat. To Colonel Madsen, it looked like suicide. The data screamed that she was now trapped between the mountain and the remaining heavy gun. But to Anya, it was the setup for her next move. The enemy expected her to be predictable, to follow the established patterns of air assault. They expected her to prioritize the safety of her aircraft. They were wrong on all counts. She was about to show them something that wasn't in any of their manuals. The pivotal maneuver was a symphony of madness and precision. Anya wasn't just flying the Black Hawk. She was merging with it, her instincts flowing directly into the flight controls. Having dipped below the ridgeline, she was now flying parallel to it, using the massive rock formation as a shield from the eastern Dushka and the repositioned RPGs. But the SEALs were on top of the ridge. To get to them, she would have to expose herself. The conventional approach would be to pop up, hover, extract, and fly away, a maneuver that would give the enemy a stationary target for a fatal 10 to 15 seconds. Anya had no intention of being stationary. Evans, call out the wind shear. Crew chief, get the ropes ready, but I don't think we'll need them. Trident lead, I'm coming in hot on a single skid touch. I'm going to give you exactly 5 seconds. Get your men ready to jump. There will be no second pass. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. A single skid touch or pinnacle landing involved balancing the multi-ton helicopter on a tiny point of contact like a ballerina on point, with the rotors still at full power. It was a maneuver practiced in training under ideal conditions. Anya was proposing to do it at night, on a jagged, unfamiliar rock face, under heavy fire, with unpredictable winds from an approaching storm. Copy, Valkyrie. We'll be ready, Trident lead replied, a new steel in his voice. His men were already moving to the edge of the precipice. Anya pushed the nose down, accelerating along the face of the cliff. The ground proximity warning system screamed a solid, unbroken tone. Evans's eyes were glued to the radar altimeter, watching the numbers plummet. 50 feet, 40, 30. I have the rock, Anya said calmly. She could see it on the fleur, a small, flat-topped outcropping just large enough for one landing gear skid. It was their entire landing zone. She pulled back on the cyclic and fed in the collective, a violent, coordinated maneuver that bled off her forward momentum in a breathtaking flare. The Black Hawk pivoted on its own axis, its nose rising sharply as its tail swung around, kicking up a blizzard of dust and pebbles. For a terrifying moment, the aircraft was a stationary target, exposed above the ridgeline. As if on cue, the world erupted. The eastern Dushka opened up, its tracers a storm of green lines converging on their position. An RPG streaked past the cockpit, a fiery comet that detonated against the cliff face behind them. The helicopter shuddered from the concussion. But Anya wasn't there anymore. The flare had been a feint, a move designed to draw their fire. As the enemy shooters corrected their aim, Anya was already dropping the nose, kicking the tail pedal and sliding the aircraft sideways directly toward the rock outcropping. She didn't land on it. She collided with it, a controlled crash that she absorbed through the controls. The right landing skid screeched as it made contact with the rock. The Black Hawk balanced precariously, its main rotor blades clearing the cliff edge by inches, the tail boom hanging over a 1,000-foot drop. Go! 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 Anya's voice was a guttural command. The door gunners unleashed hell. The minigun on the left and a .50 caliber machine gun on the right laid down a curtain of suppressive fire so thick and terrifying that it forced every enemy head down. Under this canopy of flying brass, the cabin door was thrown open. The 4 SEALs didn't need to be told twice. They launched themselves from the ledge into the open door of the helicopter. It wasn't a graceful embarkation. It was a desperate, practiced scramble. The last man, Trident lead, was hauled in by the crew chief as bullets sparked off the rock around his feet. Last man's in, the crew chief yelled. The entire evolution, From the moment the skid touched the rock to the last seal clearing the door had taken 4 seconds. Anya didn't wait for confirmation. The moment she felt the weight shift as the last man boarded, she was already in motion. She kicked the left pedal, pushing the tail out over the abyss, and shoved the cyclic forward, rolling the Black Hawk off its precarious perch. They didn't lift off. They fell, dropping back down into the relative safety below the ridgeline. An instant later, another RPG slammed into the rock where they had just been, a venomous, futile strike. She firewalled the engines, and Nightshade 1 clawed its way forward, hugging the terrain as it accelerated away from Serpent's Tooth, leaving behind a baffled and decimated enemy force firing wildly into the empty night. A stunned silence reigned in the TOC. The 30 people in the room had just watched a pilot defy physics, doctrine, and the fundamental laws of survival. The drone feed showed the Black Hawk, now a small, receding silver shape on the infrared display, speeding away from the mountain. The 4 heat signatures of the SEAL team were safely inside it. The red triangles of the enemy forces were scattered and disorganized, firing at a ghost. Colonel Madsen slowly lowered his microphone. He took off his command headset and placed it carefully on the console in front of him. He stared at the screen, at the successful extraction that his every instinct and every piece of data had told him was impossible. He had been prepared to lose 4 of the best operators in the command. He had been prepared to inform their families. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for Anya Rostova. He ran a hand over his face, the fatigue of the last few hours settling deep into his bones. The lieutenant at the comm station looked over at him, his young face alight with awe. "Sir, I've never seen anything like it." Madsen didn't respond. He simply watched the screen until the dot that was Nightshade 1 was clear of the threat ring. He picked up the secure line that connected him directly to the flight line. The crew chief who had launched Anya without official orders answered on the first ring, his voice wary. "Go for tower. This is Havoc TOC," Madsen said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "Have a full medical team standing by for Nightshade 1's arrival, and have a fresh maintenance crew ready. I want that bird inspected, refueled, and rearmed within the hour. Whatever she needs, give it to her." "Sir, yes, sir," the crew chief replied, the surprise evident in his tone. On the flight back, the interior of the Black Hawk was a study in controlled chaos. The cabin was dark, lit only by the faint red glow of the emergency lights. The air smelled of sweat, cordite, and hot metal. The 4 SEALs sat on the floor, stripping magazines, checking their gear, their movements economical and exhausted. One of them, the team medic, was working on a deep gash on his comrade's arm. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were alive, a state of being that had seemed like a fantasy only minutes before. Trident Lead moved forward, bracing himself against the bulkhead, and leaned toward the cockpit. He could see Anya's silhouette against the glowing instrument panel. She was still a picture of absolute calm, her hands moving smoothly on the controls as she navigated through the increasingly turbulent air of the storm front. He keyed his helmet mic to the aircraft's internal channel. "Valkyrie." Anya's voice came back in his ear, placid as ever. "Go ahead, Trident." "Just, thank you," he said, the 2 words carrying the weight of 4 lives. "We owe you." Anya simply nodded, her eyes never leaving the view outside the canopy. For her, the mission wasn't over until the wheels were down and the engines were off. Praise was a distraction. The only thing that mattered was the next step, the next input, the next safe heading. When Nightshade 1 finally touched down at the forward operating base, the landing was so gentle it felt as if the ground had risen to meet them. The rain from the storm had just begun to fall, hissing against the hot skin of the helicopter. As the ramp lowered, the waiting medical team swarmed the aircraft. The SEALs disembarked, battered but whole, giving the crew chief a single, hard nod as they passed. In the TOC, the mission was officially logged as a success. A debriefing would follow, reports would be filed. But for now, an unofficial quiet had descended. Colonel Madsen walked out of the operations center and stood in the rain, watching the flight line. He saw the ground crew moving around the Black Hawk with a new kind of reverence. He saw the SEALs being led to the medical tent, their exhausted faces etched with a gratitude that transcended words. His gaze fell on the pilot as she finally emerged. Anya Rostova swung down from the cockpit, her helmet under her arm. She moved with a weary grace, her flight suit soaked through. She began her post-flight inspection, her hand running along the fuselage, checking for damage. Her crew chief approached her, holding out a maintenance log. He didn't say a word, just looked at her with an expression of profound, unadulterated respect. He pointed to a fresh series of pockmarks from shrapnel near the tail boom, and she simply nodded, making a mental note. It was just another scar for the aircraft to wear. Madsen walked across the tarmac, the rain plastering his uniform to his shoulders. He stopped a few feet from her. Anya looked up, her expression neutral, expecting a reprimand for disobeying a direct order. She was prepared for the consequences. It wouldn't be the first time. The colonel looked from her to the formidable machine behind her, its rotors slowly ticking to a stop in the rain. He looked at the scarred panel near the cockpit, the fresh bullet marks on the tail. He saw not just a piece of hardware, but a comrade, an extension of the woman who flew it. He finally met her eyes. He didn't speak of insubordination or regulations. He didn't mention the 92% probability of failure. He simply raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. It wasn't the salute of a superior officer to a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a warrior, a recognition that went beyond rank and procedure, an acknowledgement of a skill so profound it bordered on artistry. Anya Rostova held his gaze for a long moment. Then, she returned the salute with a crisp, economical motion. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The silence, punctuated only by the falling rain and the cooling clicks of the Black Hawk's engines, said everything. Respect had been earned. Not in a briefing room with words and PowerPoint slides, but in the crucible of a dark valley, with skill, instinct, and a courage that defied all calculations. As she walked away into the rain, leaving the helicopter to tick and settle behind her, she was no longer just a pilot in his command. She was a legend, forged in a single impossible pass. Her file would be updated, but her story would be told in the hushed, reverent tones of soldiers in hangars and briefing rooms for years to come.